The principle of the integral yoga. The principle of yoga is the turning of one or of all parts of our human existence into a means of reaching the divine being. In an ordinary yoga, one main power of being or one group of its powers is made the means, vehicle, path. In a synthetic yoga, all powers will be combined and included in the transmuting instrumentation. In Hatha yoga, the instrument is the body and life. All the power of the body is stilled, collected, purified, heightened, concentrated to its utmost limits or beyond any limits by asana and other physical processes. The power of the life too is similarly purified, heightened, concentrated by asana and pranayama. This concentration of powers is then directed towards that physical center in which the divine consciousness sits concealed in the human body. The power of life, nature power, coiled up with all its secret forces asleep in the lowest nervous plexus of the earth being, for only so much escapes into waking action in our normal operations as is sufficient for the limited uses of human life, rises awakened through center after center, and awakens too in its ascent and passage the forces of each successive nodus of our being, the nervous life, the heart of emotion, and ordinary mentality, the speech, sight, will, the higher knowledge, till through and above the brain it meets with and it becomes one with the divine consciousness. In Raj Yoga, the chosen instrument is the mind. Our ordinary mentality is first disciplined, purified, and directed towards the divine being. Then by a summary process of asana and pranayama, the physical force of our being is stilled and concentrated, the life force released into a rhythmic movement capable of cessation and concentrated into a higher power of its upward action. The mind, supported and strengthened by this greater action and concentration of the body and life upon which it rests, is itself purified of all its unrest and emotion and its habitual thought waves, liberated from distraction and dispersion, given its highest force of concentration, gathered up into a trance of absorption. Two objects, the one temporal, the other eternal, are gained by this discipline. Mind power develops in another concentrated action, abnormal capacities of knowledge, effective will, deep light of reception, powerful light of thought radiation, which are altogether beyond the narrow range of our normal mentality. It arrives at the yogic or occult powers around which there has been woven so much quite dispensable and yet perhaps salutary mystery. But the one final end and the one all-important gain is that the mind, stilled and cast into a concentrated trance, can lose itself in the divine consciousness and the soul be made free to unite with the divine being. The triple way takes for its chosen instruments the three main powers of the mental soul life of the human being. Knowledge selects the reason and the mental vision, and it makes them by purification, concentration, and a certain discipline of a God-directed seeking is means for the greatest knowledge and the greatest vision of all, God knowledge and God vision. Its aim is to see, know, and be the divine. Works, action, selects for its instrument the will of the doer of works. It makes life an offering of sacrifice to the Godhead, and by purification, concentration, and a certain discipline of subjection to the divine will, a means for contact and increasing unity of the soul of man with the divine master of the universe. Devotion selects the emotional and aesthetic powers of the soul, and by turning them all Godward in a perfect purity, intensity, infinite passion of seeking, makes them a means of God possession in one or many relations of unity with the divine being. All aim in their own way at a union or unity of the human soul with the Supreme Spirit. Each yoga in its process has the character of the instrument it uses. Thus, the Hatha yogic process is psychophysical, the Raj yogic mental and psychic, the way of knowledge is spiritual and cognitive, the way of devotion spiritual, emotional, and aesthetic, the way of works spiritual and dynamic by action. Each is guided in the ways of its own characteristic power, but all power is in the end one. All power is really soul power. In the ordinary process of life, body, and mind, this truth is quite obscured by the dispersed, dividing, and distributive action of nature, which is the normal condition of all our functionings, although even there it is in the end evident. For all material energy contains hidden the vital, mental, psychic, spiritual energy, and in the end, it must release these forms of the one Shakti. The vital energy conceals and liberates into action all the other forms. The mental supporting itself on the life and body and their powers and functionings contains undeveloped or only partially developed the psychic and the spiritual power of the being. But when by yoga any of these powers is taken up from the dispersed and distributive action, raised to its highest degree, concentrated, it becomes manifest soul power and reveals the essential unity. Therefore, the Hatha yogic process has too its pure psychic and spiritual result. The Raj yogic arrives by psychic means at a spiritual consummation. The triple way may appear to be altogether mental and spiritual in its way of seeking and its objectives, but it can be attended by results more characteristic of the other paths, which offer themselves in a spontaneous and involuntary flowering, and for the same reason, because soul power is all power, and where it reaches its height in one direction, its other possibilities also begin to show themselves, in fact, or in incipient potentiality. This unity at once suggests the possibility of a synthetic yoga. Tantric discipline is in its nature a synthesis. It has seized on the large universal truth that there are two poles of being whose essential unity is the secret of existence, Brahman and Shakti, spirit and nature, and that nature is power of the spirit, or rather is spirit as power. To raise nature in man into manifest power of the spirit is its method, and it is the whole nature that it gathers up for the spiritual conversion. It includes in its system of instrumentation the forceful Hatha yogic process and especially the opening up of the nervous centers and the passage through them of the awakened Shakti on her way to her union with the Brahman. The subtlest trace of the Raja Yogic purification, meditation, and concentration, the leverage of will force, the motive power of devotion, the key of knowledge. But it does not stop short with an effective assembling of the different powers of these specific yogas. In two directions, it enlarges by its synthetic turn the province of the yogic method. First, it lays its hand firmly on many of the main springs of human quality, desire, action, and it subjects them to an intensive discipline with the soul's mastery of its motives as a first aim and their elevation to a diviner spiritual level as its final utility. Again, it includes in its objects of yoga not only liberation, which is the one all-mastering preoccupation of the specific systems, but a cosmic enjoyment of the power of the spirit, which the others may take incidentally on the way, in part, casually, but avoid making a motive or object. It is a bolder and larger system. In the method of synthesis which you have been following, another clue of principle has been pursued, which is derived from another view of the possibilities of yoga. This starts from the method of Vedanta to arrive at the aim of the Tantra. In the tantric method, Shakti is all important, becomes the key to the finding of spirit. In this synthesis spirit, soul is all important, becomes the secret of the taking up of Shakti. The tantric method starts from the bottom and grades the ladder of ascent upwards to the summit. Therefore, its initial stress is upon the action of the awakened Shakti in the nervous system of the body and its centers. The opening of the 6 lotuses is the opening up of the ranges of the power of the spirit. Our synthesis takes man as a spirit in mind, much more than a spirit in body, and assumes in him the capacity to begin on that level to spiritualize his being, by the power of the soul in mind opening itself directly to a higher spiritual force and being, and to perfect by that higher force so possessed and brought into action the whole of his nature. For that reason, our initial stress has fallen upon the utilization of the powers of the soul in mind and the turning of the triple key of knowledge, works, and love in the locks of the spirit. The Hatha yogic methods can be dispensed with, though there is no objection to their partial use. The Raj yogic will only enter in as an informal element. To arrive by the shortest way at the largest development of spiritual power and being, and divinize by it a liberated nature in the whole range of human living, is our inspiring motive. The principle in view is a self-surrender, a giving up of the human being into the being, consciousness, power, delight of the divine, a union or communion at all the points of meeting in the soul of man, the mental being, by which the divine himself, directly and without veil, master and possessor of the instrument, shall by the light of his presence and guidance perfect the human being in all the forces of nature for a divine living. Here we arrive at a further enlargement of the objects of the yoga. The common initial purpose of all yoga is the liberation of the soul of man from its present natural ignorance and limitation, its release into spiritual being, its union with the highest self and divinity. But ordinarily, this is made not only the initial but the whole and final object. Enjoyment of spiritual being there is, but either in a dissolution of the human and individual into the silence of self being, or on a higher plane in another existence. The tantric system makes liberation the final but not the only aim. It takes on its way a full perfection and enjoyment of the spiritual power, light, and joy in the human existence. And even it has a glimpse of a supreme experience in which liberation and cosmic action and enjoyment are unified in a final overcoming of all oppositions and dissonances. It is this wider view of our spiritual potentialities from which we begin, but we add another stress which brings in a completer significance. We regard the spirit in man not as solely an individual being traveling to a transcendent unity with the divine, but as a universal being capable of oneness with the divine in all souls and all nature, and we give this extended view its entire practical consequence. The human soul's individual liberation and enjoyment of union with the divine in spiritual being, consciousness, and delight must always be the first object of the yoga. Its free enjoyment of the cosmic unity of the divine becomes a second object. But out of that a third appears, the effectuation of the meaning of the divine unity with all beings by a sympathy and participation in the spiritual purpose of the divine in humanity. The individual yoga then turns from its separateness and becomes a part of the collective yoga of the divine nature in the human race. The liberated individual being, united with the divine in self and spirit, becomes in his natural being a self-perfecting instrument for the perfect outflowering of the divine in humanity. This outflowing has its two terms. First comes the growth out of the separative human ego into the unity of the spirit. Then the possession of the divine nature in its proper and its higher forms, and no longer in the inferior forms of the mental being, which are a mutilated translation and not the authentic text of the original script of divine nature in the cosmic individual. In other words, a perfection has to be aimed at which amounts to the elevation of the mental into the full spiritual and supramental nature. Therefore, this integral yoga of knowledge, love, and works has to be extended into a yoga of spiritual and Gnostic self-perfection. As Gnostic knowledge, will and ananda are a direct instrumentation of spirit and can only be won by growing into the spirit, into divine being. This growth has to be the first aim of our yoga. The mental being has to enlarge itself into the oneness of the divine before the divine will perfect in the soul of the individual its Gnostic outflowering. That is the reason why the triple way of knowledge, works, and love becomes the keynote of the whole yoga. For that is the direct means for the soul in mind to rise to its highest intensities, where it passes upward into the divine oneness. That too is the reason why the yoga must be integral. For if emergence in the infinite or some close union with the divine were all our aim, an integral yoga would be superfluous except for such greater satisfaction of the being of man as we may get by a self-lifting of the whole of it towards its source. But it would not be needed for the essential aim, since by any single power of the soul nature we can meet with the divine. Each at its height rises up into the infinite and absolute. Each therefore offers a sufficient way of arrival, for all the 100 separate paths meet in the eternal. But the Gnostic being is a complete enjoyment and possession of the whole divine and spiritual nature, and it is a complete lifting of the whole nature of man into its power of a divine and spiritual existence. Integrality becomes then an essential condition of this yoga. At the same time, we have seen that each of the three ways at its height, if it is pursued with a certain largeness, can take into itself the powers of the others and lead to their fulfillment. It is therefore sufficient to start by one of them and find the point at which it meets the other at first parallel lines of advance and melts into them by its own widenings. At the same time, a more difficult, complex, wholly powerful process would be to start, as it were, on the three lines together, on a triple wheel of soul power. But the consideration of this possibility must be postponed till we have seen what are the conditions and means of the yoga of self-perfection. For we shall see that this also need not be postponed entirely, but a certain preparation of it is part of, and a certain initiation into it proceeds by the growth of the divine works, love, and knowledge.